everyone, it's Rebecca from the Glitch Stitchery. Today I want to talk about the next piece in my weaving series. So it's a series of videos on how I personally plan weaving projects and approach them, and hopefully it'll help some of you who are fairly new to weaving. I'm sorry for any noises you hear in the background. My roommate hasn't left yet, so hopefully it's not too distracting. So one of the projects I made fairly recently was this woven scarf, and it's my sampler, so it has all these textured patterns to it, and it's cool actually because when I washed it, it tightened up really nice, so it feels really nice right now. Anyway, I'm going to be designing something similar to this, although much smaller, and just discussing with you how to plan something like this, how to approach it, and showing you the weaving process as well, so you can get a feel for how to do this yourself. Now this is a reasonably advanced project. Like, I'm not gonna say it's some masterful project. It's a rigid heddle project, and I'm not even using 2 heddles or anything. It's a 1 heddle project. But if you are really new to weaving, you might want to start with parts 1 and 2 of this series. So that would be the part on warp and the part on weft. This is part 3, designing a sampler. So I already counted the number of holes on my heddle. Between the slots and the holes, there are 80 holes total. And that's the maximum number of strands I could have in this project. I am not going to the maximum though, so I am working with this as my graph paper for designing the patterns. And it's a little bit limited. So I'm going with 32 strands across, and then some floating warp strands in a slightly different color, so that way I can see where the floats start. Now as for the warping, it's going to be single threaded warp, which, as I mentioned in video 1, I will show you when it's warped how to do that part. It's very similar to the double threaded warping I did in the first video, but there is one slight difference, and that's what I'm going to show you. After it's warped and ready, we will start on the weaving. And well, okay, in between that, so in between the warping and the weaving, I'm going to show you how to make a weaving draft and plan out your patterns. I'm only going to be planning 4 patterns, and if I have more room, I'll just repeat them. You can plan out as many as you want. If you want, you could do a sample ahead of time and figure out like how many well, in crochet it'd be how many stitches per inch, but that's obviously not what we're doing. We're doing weaving. So how many picks per inch you get, and then you could be like, well, if I get this many per this amount, then I can make the warp this length and plan out exactly how many inches of each pattern. That's a lot of work. And for a sampler, you don't necessarily have to do that. You can keep it in mind, and if you want to do a full project like that, more power to you. That is not what I'm doing. So I'll plan 4 designs. We'll start weaving, and hopefully we'll get this done fairly quickly so we can move on to part 4 of this series, which will be either weaving houndstooth or weaving with a clasped weft. I'm not sure yet. They're both going to be in there. I'm just not sure which one will come first. So let's get to work. All right, we are at the point where it's time to plan out our patterns for our sampler project. So I just have a black pen and a white pen over here. The white pen's for if I make mistakes, so it's going to stay out of the way for now. Since my warp is going to be 32 strands across, I have it marked out, 32 strands, so I can keep track. The dark part is the floating warps on either side, so that I can make sure everything stays even on the edges. Beyond that, I have another page ready too. So this will be fairly simple, but we're just going to start with the basics. So when you color in a square, that is a strand you go over top of. Right now, each square equals 1 strand of warp. For each line, I'm going to go over it once in both directions. So go over this way, go over that way. And there'll be 2 wefts per each block and 1 warp. Hopefully you understand what I mean. It might make more sense once I actually start weaving. So first, over 1, under 3, over 1, under 3, over 1, under 3, over 1, under 3. And you just go across the first line. So you just block in 1 square and then 3 empty squares in between. So the next row is going to be right here. Over 1, and again skip 3. And again. And again. And if all you wanted was diagonal lines, this is actually where it would start repeating and you would start here again. Alternatively, we could do a chevron and start doing it like this. And if you want the chevron to repeat, then it would repeat again like this. And honestly, most of this stuff that I'm doing, you would just take some graph paper and start playing around and see what you like. When you find a design you like, you try weaving it and see how it looks. You can get a lot of really interesting ideas just from experimenting like that. There are no set rules necessarily. Just keep in mind that if you have a lot of, how do I put this? If there are a lot of parts where you have a lot of strands going over and not a lot going under, or vice versa, then you might end up with an area that would snag really easy or wouldn't have a lot of structural integrity. Like when I did my first sampler and I did my name, it doesn't have a lot of structural integrity, so it's going to have some issues most likely if I actually try to use it for something. But for just a sampler, I mean, something like this would work fine. So that's how you would get the chevron shape, just with every 3, there's 3 spaces in between each of these. That looks good. Now for this one, let's say I wanted to do a checkerboard. So if I do this, that means I'm going to be going over 2 strands. And I just go like that. I mean, this one's fairly self-explanatory, I think. And you can make these sections as large or as small as you want. Mine are probably not going to be super large. just because I am trying to get through this fairly quickly. It's more just demonstrating techniques than trying to make a project. So hopefully I'll finish quickly. So yeah, checkerboard would be very basic, very easy to do. You wouldn't even necessarily have to draft that out. Alright, let's see. Now, what are some other... You can do checkerboards in different ways, of course, but one thing I've been wanting to try is something more like this. What would a thinner checkerboard look like? I don't know yet. And it's just a lot of coloring in boxes while you figure out what you're doing. The actual weaving part is significantly more interesting, but you always should set up ahead of time so you know what you're doing. You can go in and just freehand it, but it won't necessarily go well, and it's kind of hard to undo it once you've done it. So you might as well prepare ahead of time and be all set and know pretty much what you're doing. Alright, so there's that. We're going to do those 3 patterns. Alright, hopefully you can see what I'm doing. So right now, I have it all ready for me to finish warping it for a single threaded warp. In other words, a normal warp, like what most people do. So right now, as you can see, there are 2 strings coming through each of the slots and nothing coming through the holes. What we gotta do is get one of the strands going through each slot, going through one of the holes. And when you're actually warping, all this means is that as you are dragging the loops through, you only work through the slots, and then you just do all this work at the end. Honestly, it probably takes about the same amount of time either way. It's just I normally am working with a finer yarn, so I'm happier with a double threaded warp. But there's nothing wrong with doing it this way. This is, as I said, probably the more traditional, normal way. So what we're gonna do is I put my hand behind there and I get my little hook through the hole and I hook one strand on there, and I try not to split the yarn ideally. And then I very carefully pull it through. And there we go, one in each. Put that to the side so it's out of the way. Get the next one. What did I do here? Oh, I guess I'm going in that direction. That's fine. That works too. Alright, put it through the hole. Get a strand. Now we got the yarn going through a hole, slot, hole, slot. Put them to the side. Next 2. And as always, be very careful not to split the yarn because that just makes more trouble later. But there's 6 right there. Set it to the side, and it just goes like that the whole way across. I'm going to put in time lapse for this. Alright, so I got a couple inches of plain weave done just so we have a nice foundation to build on for the pattern parts. So what we're going to be doing for the first pattern part is that over 1 under 3 chevron I showed you. Now these strands at the end here are the floats. So these are not part of the pattern. We go over and under the strands just like we would normally, and this will make sure that we have a nice solid straight edge. The pattern part is just the orange parts in the middle. So to start this, we are going to go just back and forth through these like we're supposed to. And this would work easier if my shuttle was a little bit less loaded. But all right, for the orange, over 1, under 3, over 1, under 3, over 1, under 3, over 1, under 3. You just keep going like that the whole way across. Then we get back to the red part and we just do a normal over under. Now I tend to go through and do the same thing again on the return pass, just to make sure that the pattern's really visible, and it's also easier for me if I don't have to do the lines more than once. So, and then under, over. And just be very careful not to mess it up. And I do use my hands a lot to make sure I'm getting what I need to. And back across the floats. And this would be easier if you're doing this for the first time in a chunkier yarn, because then you can see what you're doing a little better. This one's a little bit fine for this. All right, so that was row 1 on my pattern, and I'm just going to take a pen, and if you look at the draft, I'm going to make sure that I put a check mark over here so I know where I am. I'm just going to keep working my way up. So this one will be under 1 over in the orange part, and move on from there. So again, for the red part, we just go over and under based on what we did the previous row. We do the opposite. We go over, okay, so under 1, over 1, under 3, 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 over 1, alright, cool. And then again, we do the floats based on what we did the last row, we do the opposite. So, here we go. And you can already start seeing a pattern developing down here. Alright, cool. So I'm actually going to turn it into time lapse for a bit, because I think you get basically what I'm doing here. And then after I finish this section, I'll do another little bit of plain weave, and then we'll go on to the next section. So, see you later. Alright, so that was the first pattern section. I'm just doing little sections just to show you how it looks. It's just a sampler. I'm not trying to do anything particularly complicated here. So what you want to do, make sure you do is that after you do each pattern section, do a little bit of plain weave just to give it that balance back and make sure everything has a solid foundation so you can work on it without it warping or getting a little off. And actually, while I'm on the subject, when you were warping the loom, ideally you would warp it so that this is centered. I just wasn't really paying attention when I warped it and it ended up really off center. So it doesn't make a huge difference necessarily, but sometimes if it's off center, the heddle has a harder time and the whole thing ends up a little bit cockeyed. Anyway, not like end of the world, but just something to keep in mind. So the next one we're going to do is the checkerboard. So it's going to be over 2 strands, under, over, yeah. And then it's going to be 2 sets. So I'm going to be going over these 4 times technically, because I go back and forth for each of the lines on my draft, and we're going to be doing that twice. So we'll see how that goes, and I will go into time lapse because I think you understand what I'm talking about. If not, you will once you see what I'm doing. So back to time lapse. Alright, so I had to change the project around a bit. I thought that the 2 yarns I was using were a little too close in color and I couldn't really see it very well on camera, so hopefully using some of the scraps from my sunflower project will work a little bit better. I can definitely see this. Alright, so this one is over 2, under 3, and I just continued that pattern across the whole thing to get those nice diagonal lines. And this one is the same over 2, under 2 checkerboard that I did in the beginning, but it's much easier to see in this other scrap of yarn. So I'm going to just continue doing different patterns in different scraps of yarn that I can see better, and we'll just continue working on that. Alright, so I finished my sampler. I'm just going to pull it off the loom and show you what I did as I pull it off the loom, because there was a lot of parts where it would have been very slow to show you what I was doing as I was doing it, and it would have made this video like 3 hours long. So we're just going to do it this way. This one I just sort of free-handed a diamond. Since I knew it was 32 stitches here, I made it so it would fall in the center here, and then just lined everything up according to that. I do think if I do another one of these, I will make a smaller portion at the top of each one so it looks a little better. This one is pretty much the same as the checkerboard, or I mean, it's probably actually called basket weave, to be honest. I just call it checkerboard because that's what it looks like. But I alternated colors for the checkerboard portion. I love the texture of this one. It has a very squishy texture to it. This one was just me choosing random spots to make a little line of, man, I don't know what that's called. I saw someone call something similar to this spot lace, but I don't think that's right. And I was just seeing what it looked like if I alternated colors again. More of the checkerboard slash basket weave. And this one is under 2, over 3, under 2, over 3, and then the next one is over 3, under 2, and then I just alternated like that. And then it just goes back into the ones that we already talked about. It's not a super long scarf. So I'm going to remove this from the loom, and then I'm going to get warped up for part 4. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. If you like my work and would like to see more, please follow the links in the description below to my Instagram and blog, or show your support by buying me a coffee. Most of all, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.